Few military forces are as known worldwide for their toughness, tenacity, skill, and fighting spirit as the United States Marines. However, they are often overlooked in the history of the Old West, and that just doesn't sit right with us here at HOKC. So, we've decided to do our part to remedy this problem with tonight's episode, Old West Battles of the U.S. Marines. First up, the brutal, little-known conflict that occurred just outside of today's San Diego, California. Join us now for the Battle of San Pasqual.
San Diego, California, December 5th, 1846. As a dreary overcast sky looms above them, Captain Archibald Gillespie and his detachment of 40 U.S. Marines ride east from the city into the dry, chaparral-covered desert that looms endlessly before them. They are on their way to join forces with Brigadier General Stephen F. Kearney and his force of 200 troops, who have sent word to the Marines that they are caught in dire straits in the middle of the Southern California desert. General Kearney and his men have traveled to their current location, roughly 30 miles east of the bustling pueblo of San Diego, as part of the United States' efforts during the ongoing Mexican-American War. Though they have endured seemingly endless hardships on their journey from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the city of Santa Fe, and then across the vast expanses of the deserts of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, before finally reaching the deserts of Alta California, most of the men are eager to find and engage their enemy in the Mexican army. However, General Kearney's force is still diminutive in size and thousands of miles away from their closest support to the east. Seeing the increasingly dangerous circumstances, Kearney had seen it necessary to send a rider to San Diego requesting reinforcements. This request reached the headquarters of Captain Archibald Gillespie, where he had hurriedly marshaled the contingent of U.S. Marines he now leads eastward in their effort to reach General Kearney and his men before they are forced to engage with the local forces that are surely reconnoitering the hills around them. These local forces, Gillespie and his men are well aware, are unlike the rest of their counterparts in the Mexican army, whom the U.S. forces have combated in the previous few years. With Alta or Upper California comprising the northernmost reaches of Mexican territory, its inhabitants, Mexican citizens known as Californios, have adapted their country's culture to fit their environs. In the vast expanses of Californio ranchos, which could comprise thousands of acres, becoming an adept horseman was essential not only for working vaqueros, but also everyday citizens simply wishing to get from one place to another in this expansive land. Throughout the whole of Mexico, the Californios were regarded as unmatched in not only their horsemanship, but their adroitness in wielding their long leather riatas, precursors to the modern-day cowboy's rope. It was said that a Californio would rather climb atop his horse and ride 100 yards rather than walk it, and that any Californio was a better roper with his foot than the average Mexican was with his hand. But these are not the only attributes that separate the Californio soldiers that General Kearney and his men will be facing and the regular Mexican army fighting further to the south. Their most noticeable characteristic, and perhaps their most dangerous, is evident even from afar to the scouts and soldiers watching them from the cover of the dense chaparral brush. Long, steel-tipped lances jut upward several feet from over the heads of each Californio rider, giving them an air of medieval simplicity that seems antiquated even here in the 1840s Southern California desert. But, while many among the Americans find the spectacle to be nearly comical, the damage that these lances can inflict is far from a laughing matter for anyone faced with combating them. Though the Californios are lacking in way of firearms and ammunition, their ability to inflict grievous wounds upon their adversaries before dashing away gives them a capability scarcely seen outside of the mighty tribes of the American plains, like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Comanche. Against a fighting force armed with single-shot carbines, they present a formidable foe. It had been at what history has come to know as the Battle of the Old Woman's Gun, when a detachment of unfortunate U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers had attempted to march on the burgeoning city of Los Angeles in an effort to quell an uprising in the area that had been previously conquered by American forces. This detachment, composed of 310 men, had been caught by the Californios just outside of the city and made to pay dearly over the course of a battle that lasted a night and the succeeding day. During the engagement, 4 American sailors had been killed, and 6 additional men gravely wounded at the end of the Californios' lances. Captain Archibald Gillespie, for his part, has spent the previous few months clinging tenuously to any semblance of power over the city of Los Angeles, having been appointed to the post by Robert F. Stockton, with explicit orders to rule over the city with a strict eye and an unforgiving hand. But, after continued unrest from the inhabitants of the city, with some in support of the Americans' efforts and some vehemently opposed, Stockton and Gillespie retreated southward by sailing to San Diego on October 26, 1846. They arrived 5 days later, on October 31st, and were welcomed by the local inhabitants of the besieged city to take part in their celebrations of All Souls' Day. However, despite their warm reception, the men had found San Diego to be all but bereft of usable horses, mules, and cattle. While Stockton had returned north to Monterey, where Commanding Officer John C. Fremont was experiencing similar problems, Captain Gillespie and his men had set about procuring as many animals and supplies as they could while staying within the good graces of the citizens. At this critical juncture in the Mexican-American War, the Americans now found themselves clinging to largely nominal control of the Southern California coastline stretching down from San Francisco. They were running low on men, ammunition, and supplies. However, General John Kearney, on his trek westward from the desert, mistakenly believed his countrymen to have solidified a strong measure of control over nearly the whole of the territory. In the middle of the New Mexico desert, Kearney and his men had happened upon none other than the legendary mountain man Kit Carson, whom John C. Fremont had dispatched to Washington to carry correspondence regarding the Americans' progress in Alta California. After reviewing these dispatches, General Kearney had felt so hopeful as to the state of the Americans' advancement that he sent nearly half of his forces back to Santa Fe. He did, however, enlist the famed Carson to accompany him and his men back to Southern California. Now, Carson, among the most experienced in the group by far in matters of frontier warfare, rides with Kearney's cavalry, dressed in his mountain man trappings and sitting astride his sure-footed mule. He shares Kearney's growing concern with the group's isolation. The men amongst the cavalry, however, are by and large in high spirits, despite the toll taken on themselves and their animals by the months-long journey west. They have come here to fight what they believe to be a markedly inferior enemy, not only lacking in their training and equipment, but in fact relegated to using centuries-old technology in a desperate bid against a superior foe. Still, the obviousness of their predicament is not lost on the men of the cavalry, and all among them welcome the sight of Captain Gillespie and his Marines rumbling towards them in the afternoon, kicking up a sizable cloud of dust and towing with them a small brass cannon to add to the artillery firepower of the soldiers. Kearney and Carson both warmly greet Gillespie, who informs the general, much to his chagrin, that the state of affairs for the Americans in Southern California has deteriorated, even in the time since Carson has skulked out of San Diego with his secret correspondence for President James K. Polk. He also assures them that their suspicions that the Californios might be very close by are likely justified. Unfortunately for the Americans, Gillespie is more correct than he knows, as word of he and his men's departing San Diego has already reached two nearby parties of Californio Lancers. One, commanded by Leonardo Cota and Jose Alipas, is stationed at San Luis Rey to the north. When word reaches their headquarters, a contingent of Lancers immediately heads south to join forces with their brethren in order to mount an attack. Meanwhile, the second contingent of Lancer forces, commanded by Don Andres Pico, brother of the governor Pio Pico, is stationed in San Diego. Don Andres commands virtually the whole of the city outside of the American-held ports. He has now received word that the group of Marines has evaded Mexican security forces and is headed east into the desert. As yet unaware of Kearney's forces, they assume the men are yet again attempting to scour the countryside in search of horses and cattle. The two forces meet at San Luis Rey, where Pico, the senior officer, sees fit to divide their forces in an effort to more effectively scout the vast expanse of desert. Half of the men are sent south to El Cajon, while Pico and his contingent of 78 men make their way east into the desert, scouring the landscape for any sign of intruding American forces. In the late afternoon, the Californios arrive at the small Native American village of San Pasqual. The residents, largely terrified of the Californios after decades of incursion and mistreatment on their part, flee their homes leaving their shelters to Pico and his men. But that evening, as Pico and his men cooked their evening meals over the coals of the natives' fires, one of the tribespeople suddenly comes running back into the village, reporting that they have been found and detained by nearby American forces, numbering far larger than Pico had expected Captain Gillespie's force of Marines to be. Believing the natives' claims to be either lies or outright delusions, Pico largely dismisses them. However, only a few miles away, the flickering candles inside General Kearney's field headquarters tent illuminate the shadows of Kearney, Gillespie, Kit Carson, and a number of other officers as they now discuss what steps to take next, knowing that their enemy is almost certainly close at hand. It is decided that scouts will be sent out to reconnoiter the area and determine the size and strength of the Californio's forces. Lieutenant Thomas C. Hammond is appointed to command a small group of scouts, including some local natives, among them a man named Rafael Machado, who is familiar with both the tactics of the Californios as well as the terrain. In the pre-dawn hours, they ride into the countryside, disappearing into the darkness. Soon, Machado has discerned the location of the Californios at San Pasqual. He even crawls forward through the brush, garnering a close enough vantage point to confirm that these mostly sleeping men are in fact Pio's forces. But after Machado is gone for a longer time than he had planned, Lieutenant Hammond becomes anxious that the native Californio Machado has double-crossed him and alerted Pico's men to his presence. Concerned that they will be the victims of an ambush, Hammond orders the remainder of his men to follow him in a silent charge into the village. Despite the men remaining silent, the clattering of their weapons and the pounding of their horses' hooves alert the Californio sentries on watch. Machado is discovered by his companions in this charge, having in fact steadfastly done his duty, and now remounts and joins his cohorts in a hurried retreat as the Californio guards order them to halt. In their haste, one of the soldiers drops their dark blue coat, with the tag U.S. Army sewn on it. Now, not only is Pico aware of the presence of the Americans, he has evidence that there is a larger force afoot than the 39 Marines who had left San Diego. As Lieutenant Hammond breathlessly reports the news of their discovery to General Kearney, Kearney mulls over his options. He decides, against the advice of Carson, that since the element of surprise has now been lost, they must make their attack as quickly as possible. As an early morning frost coats the blankets of the sleeping men, and a thick fog covers the landscape, they are suddenly shaken awake by their officers, and told to make ready for a charge. After shaking off their restless night's sleep, many of the young men are eager to mount up and make the charge to glory that they have traveled so far to take part in. Kearney has, however, taken a number of steps in order to mitigate their risk. He has ordered that their main objective will be to surround the village of San Pasqual, capture their horses, and take the men prisoner. However, the general, Carson, and Gillespie are all dubious as to whether or not this plan will be entirely realistic. Meanwhile, the forward observers from Pico's force of Californios dot the horizon with their silhouettes, keenly gathering some rather surprising intelligence as they take stock of the number of Americans present, not so large that an attack would be out of the question, and the condition of their stock, who are now so gaunt after their cross-continental trek that many of them seem near death. Within 15 minutes of being awakened, the men are organizing into their well-drilled formations in preparation for battle. When they had first left Kansas, their companies had been arranged according to the color of their horses, their animals well-fed and energetic, the men's uniforms pressed and well-kempt, and their weapons cleaned, oiled, and ready for use. Now, many of the men ride mules or horses mismatched from their units, and the animals' current state significantly affects their ability to perform. To make matters worse, their carbines cannot be counted on to fire in the damp morning conditions. Thus, this attack will be relegated to swords and single-shot pistols, with the carbine's only use now being in wielding it as a club. The men separate into 3 guards, with the advance guard being commanded by Captain Abram R. Johnston. General Kearney commands the guard behind them, but as the men move out towards the small valley that ensconces the village of San Pasqual, they begin to separate from each other at a greater and greater rate during the course of their travel. As the men near the village, a critical mishap takes place. With the distance between them making the commands all but inaudible, General Kearney's command for Captain Johnston to proceed in a, quote, trot is misheard as a gallop. This is a grave mistake, as the distance to the village is too far for the exhausted horses to reach at full speed, and the advanced force would be too far ahead of the second column for the second column to provide adequate relief. Still, Johnston dutifully issues the order, and the men in the advanced column urge their horses into a gallop. Seeing this, General Kearney is horrified. He exclaims, "Good heavens, I did not mean that!" However, it is too late, and now the distance between the two forces grows even faster. Snapping into action, Kit Carson urges his mule into a full gallop of its own, attempting to catch up to the runaway column, as Kearney keeps his troops at a trot so as not to lose complete control of the battle before it begins. Carson and his mule catch up to the charging Captain Johnston, whose column is now reaching the expanse of the open valley floor. A half a mile away, they can see the village. The attack is now imminent. The 12-man column charges on, with its men roaring out in whoops and battle cries as they make their charge upon the village. But Pico and his Californios have taken cover in a small ravine next to the village, and from here let loose an initial volley of musket fire from their limited collection of firearms. As the gun smoke mixes with the thick fog, Captain Johnston falls from his mount, killed by a musket ball to the head. Riding directly behind him, Kit Carson sees the captain fall. This trips up his own mount, and his normally sure-footed mule takes a disastrous tumble to the ground, launching Carson several yards ahead of the animal, where he lands splayed out and in a daze, before hurriedly scrambling out of the way of the rest of the charging column. The charging soldiers attempt to loose a volley of their own, but most find that their weapons have indeed been rendered useless in the damp conditions. Now, the 11 remaining Americans draw their long sabers and charge head-on towards the Californios. At first, the Californios feign a retreat, momentarily seeming to scatter their forces to the west as they flee along the path of a small creek near the village. Captain Ben Moore, now the officer in charge with Johnston having been killed in the action, orders the men to pursue the Californios immediately. This the men do, giving chase down the banks of the small waterway. But this pursuit draws out their forces even further, making them easy targets for their enemy. As Kearney, Gillespie, and the rest of the men make their way across the valley as quickly as they can on their bedraggled mounts, they can only watch the horror that unfolds next. The Californios, seeing the compromised state of the Americans' forces, now wheel their fine, well-fed, and well-trained horses around, and make a head-on charge towards the soldiers still pursuing them. Within moments, they have surrounded the Americans in a whirling cyclone from which they can strike with their long lances, inflicting deep, grievous wounds, while others among them throw their leather riatas with expert efficiency, ensnaring and unsaddling riders who can then be pounced upon and dispatched in brutal fashion by other lance-wielding Californios. Captain Moore charges at Captain Pico himself, firing off an errant shot from his single-shot pistol before drawing his saber. He engages Pico, an expert swordsman, who manages to slash Moore with his own saber. As Moore attempts to fight off Pico's sword slashes and thrusts, 2 of Pico's men make separate charges upon the American officer, driving their lances deep into his torso and eventually sending him crumbling to the ground. The fall breaks the blade of Moore's saber, leaving him only the handle of the weapon with which to defend himself. He crawls to a spot near the river, attempting to club and bash any Californio who comes near, but he is soon finished off by a Californio with a pistol. Now, more Americans are starting to arrive at the battlefield, including General Kearney and Captain Gillespie. As he fights, Kearney is viciously wounded by a lance that pierces his lower back. Gillespie fights off numerous vociferous attacks directed at him by a number of attacking lancers, many of whom know who he is and are intent on exacting vengeance upon him personally. For his part, Kit Carson has managed to obtain one of the carbines from the dead U.S. soldiers, one that he miraculously finds to be in working order. He now sits ensconced behind a small rock formation, proffering effective, lethal fire against any Californio who comes within range of his position. Finally, the brass cannons being towed towards the rear of the third column are brought to the field by the American forces, and a powerful volley is let loose towards the Californios. Though it has little effect in the way of lethality, it does manage to momentarily scatter Pico's forces. Now, as Pico and his men survey the battlefield from out of range of the cannons, they are overwhelmed with a collective joy at not only having survived, but tactically dominated a better trained, better equipped, and much larger opposition force. For their part, General Kearney, Captain Gillespie, and Kit Carson are now left to survey a macabre scene of death and gore that seems to cover the whole of the valley floor. They are now trapped here, with many dead and many wounded, still 30 miles from the nearest friendly forces in San Diego, and with Pico and his Californios now stalking the hills all around them in order to cut off any route of escape. During the night, the men who are uninjured go about the grisly task of digging a large communal grave for their comrades, before laying their bodies down inside of it, covering them up, and walking their horses over the top to tamp down the ground to keep their comrades' bodies safe from the frothing packs of hungry wolves that now seem to fill the valley, having smelled the blood and viscera that now litter its floor. In the next few days, the Californios will take great hope in their ability to perhaps defend themselves from the encroaching American forces after so many months of doubt. They will hound General Kearney's forces, making any likelihood of their escape to San Diego, especially with many wounded in tow, nearly impossible. It will ultimately be up to Kit Carson, as well as a native guide and a naval officer, who will volunteer to make a death-defying nighttime trek to San Diego in hopes of garnering relief forces for their comrades. But the story of Kit Carson and his comrades' impossible task, and the conclusion of the brutal, bloody, and callous Mexican-American War are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Next up, we go to the Pacific Northwest, where the Marines take on a coalition of native forces in one of America's most pivotal, yet little-known battles, the Battle of Seattle.
Seattle, Washington, January 26, 1856. As a cold morning wind rolls in from the Pacific, a group of Nisqually warriors lie quiet in the shadowy woods surrounding the cabin of local settler Tom Pepper. They are waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their ambush on first this cabin and then the whole of the burgeoning settlement of Seattle. Several groups of their fellow warriors now lie in wait at various points around the town, waiting for their moment to strike. But just as the first rays of sunlight appear through the trees, a thunderous boom is heard coming from the bay. Then, seconds later, a few hundred yards away, the hillside seemingly explodes out of nowhere, sending chunks of soil and timber in all directions and shaking the very ground beneath them. It is an artillery shell, fired from the deck of the USS Decatur, a naval vessel harbored in the cold waters of Puget Sound. Now, chaos breaks out amongst the warriors. Their plan of attack has been compromised, but the battle has just begun, and now there is no turning back. However, with time now being of the essence, the attack on Pepper's cabin is abandoned. The main target of their attack now turns to one of the fortified American blockhouses that surround the city. The blockhouses contain a number of local militia, as well as U.S. Navy sailors and U.S. Marines charged with protecting the small settlement. Several of these defensive positions have been set in place by the captain of the Decatur, Gert Gansevoort. The navigator of the Decatur, T.S. Phelps, has spent the weeks prior to this attempting to better organize the local militia, but has been met with a staunch lack of motivation and discipline on their behalf. The sailors and Marines under his charge had acquitted themselves well in their duties, but many of the local militia had frustrated him with their lack of basic skills and their shared sentiment that Seattle was in no real danger of attack. In fact, many citizens of Seattle thought that an all-out attack from the native tribes surrounding the area was all but impossible. Now, with the attack underway, the settlement rapidly devolves into chaos. The men within the blockhouses are roused and ordered to their positions. Some of the men, primarily the Marines and sailors, begin to fire their weapons into the oncoming native warriors. But many of the militia prove to be combat ineffective, at least initially, as they intermittently abandon their positions or simply hide behind the wooden breastworks, too unnerved by the attack to mount any kind of defense. The native forces, composed of warriors from several tribes including the Nisqually, the Klickitat, the Spokane, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Yakima, and the Paleute tribe, have coalesced to resist the continued encroachment of their lands. The tensions between the Americans and the native tribes had risen to a fever pitch the year prior to this, in 1855. After the United States formally recognized the Washington territories in 1853, treaties had been struck between the U.S. government and many of the tribes surrounding the area. However, as was often the case, these agreements were often broached by the United States as expansion and settlement of the areas beyond the agreed-upon bounds continued. The Nisqually tribe, who had inhabited the inland forest and mountains for thousands of years, had initially had peaceful interactions with the government and settlers. But the 1854 Treaty of Medicine Creek had caused a sizable rift between themselves and the U.S. government when the tribe agreed to cede some of their lands, but ended up losing their prime farming territory. Among the most vocal critics of the treaty was a Nisqually chief named Leschi, who argued that the treaty was unscrupulous and unfair. He had rallied several of his fellow tribesmen to march to Olympia, demanding to see the governor, a man by the name of Colonel Isaac Stevens. But Stevens, in staunch opposition to his cause, refused to even meet with him. Seeing the treatment of their chief at the hands of the governor, many of the Nisqually had seen no other recourse but military action. Chief Leschi himself had opposed attacking the city of Seattle, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. In the weeks prior to this attack, a band of Nisqually warriors had wrought havoc on a series of settlements on nearby White Creek. Several Americans had been killed, and tensions had continued to rise. However, Governor Stevens had still dismissed any notion that there might be a large-scale attack on Seattle itself. The governor had then departed the settlement, secure in his assessment that any further violence would be limited and inconsequential. However, almost immediately following his departure, several of Seattle's native inhabitants, many of whom had developed close relationships with many of the settlers, had fervently warned their American friends that an attack was all but imminent. One Seattle resident, a local doctor named David Swinson Maynard, went so far as to evacuate 434 native residents to the west side of the bay so as to protect them from a large-scale attack on the east side of the bay. But still, many other Seattle residents agreed with Governor Stevens' assessment of the situation and continued to deny any possibility of danger. Many of the volunteer local militia had even argued in the preceding weeks that an organized defense force was needless, as the naval ship Decatur was now anchored in the bay and would provide more than enough defense against any attacking force. Now, as the native warriors flood past the defensive positions of the Marines and the militiamen, it seems to many of the residents that their hubris might now cost them their lives. As gunshots ring out up and down First Street, 52 women and children are evacuated to the Decatur, taking refuge aboard the ship while the fight unfolds. Most of the remaining native inhabitants also take to their canoes, taking to the water and visibly separating themselves from the attacking native forces in order to avoid any confusion and friendly fire. Meanwhile, the 3rd Division of Marines now decide that they must mount a head-on charge in order to drive back the oncoming warriors now pouring down the main trail into town. Seeing the dire nature of their situation, this division disobeys their orders to hold their position and charges upon one faction of the attacking warriors. The charge itself is a disorganized, haphazard affair, as the Marines charge up a steep hill to cut off the native warriors. However chaotic, though, the tactic does in fact work, repelling the oncoming warriors to the northeast and buying the other defenders precious time in order to fortify their positions inside the city limits. Tragically, though, as the Americans had begun their charge from the outskirts of Seattle,
an errant shot from one of the native warriors resulted in a young boy named Milton G. Holgate being struck and killed. Meanwhile, south of town, a prolonged but intermittent gunfight takes place between a group of Seattle citizens and a group of native warriors, the parties being separated by a large expanse of boggy territory. The fight here continues for several hours, seeing several native warriors either killed or wounded, but only one Seattle resident, a man by the name of Christian White, a relative newcomer to town, being killed when he stuck his head out from behind the log he was using as cover in order to get a drink from the nearby stream. Now, both warriors and Seattle residents settle into stalemates at every position surrounding the town, with the fight grinding on through the afternoon. Though the warriors fight valiantly, their morale soon begins to wane. Not only have they taken on more casualties than they had anticipated, but the incessant cannon fire being poured into their positions from the Decatur is making an all-out takeover of the town seem less and less probable. This adds to the demoralization of the warrior coalition, as many young men among them anticipated a great victory against the settlers, one that would drive their enemy from their territory for good. But many things have already gone wrong. First, the timing of the attack itself seems to have been a costly mistake. The initial plan had been to attack during the nighttime. Had they done this, they would likely have caught the men in the blockhouses completely off guard before the Decatur had a chance to pour in its cannon deflates. The time for this attack had, in fact, been carefully planned, and the warriors had reconnoitered the habits and routines of the military forces surrounding Seattle. They had discerned that the enlistments of the militia volunteers often expired on the 21st of the month, and thus an attack later in the month would mean striking the town when it was at its weakest. They had also watched closely as the Decatur had limped into the Puget Sound the week prior, having been badly damaged on a reef as she had made her way south along the Pacific coastline. The ship had been so badly damaged that it had to be beached for repairs. Seeing the compromised state of Seattle's defenses, many among the warriors had felt that a resounding victory had been all but assured. Now, as they hunker down behind the trees and stumps and fallen logs to avoid the gunfire coming from the settlers and the incessant fire from the Decatur, their hopes seem dashed. By early evening, as the sun begins to sink into the western horizon, the native forces begin to withdraw. Though the exact numbers of their losses are unknown, it is estimated that roughly 28 are killed. Comparatively, the Americans have suffered a total of 3 fatalities: the young Milton Holgate, the unfortunate Christian White, and another Navy sailor, a deserter from the Decatur who was mistakenly shot by a frightened settler as he attempted to barge into the settler's cabin in search of shelter from the battle. Despite the cessation of the battle, though, as the moon rises over Seattle, its residents remain in a state of vigilance and unease. They do not know whether the warriors have retreated for good or if they are merely regrouping somewhere in the dark woods. But the next day sees no attack, and it seems that the Battle of Seattle is over. But now, a fresh wave of paranoia sweeps the residents, as does a growing resentment for Governor Stevens for leaving them so vulnerable to the attack. At around noon the next day, another naval vessel, the USS Active, sails into the Puget Sound, carrying Governor Stevens. He appears before the residents, seemingly contrite and chagrined, and promises that he will order their city to be immediately fortified against another such attack. With his political and personal failure weighing heavily on both himself and his reputation, Stevens reboards the USS Active and heads back to the capital of Olympia in order to raise the alarm and make good on his promises. Several days after the attack, Nisqually Chief Leschi and a number of his fellow warriors appear at the ranch of local settler John McLeod and his Nisqually wife. They insist that they were not involved in the attack on Seattle,
They plead for the pair to argue their case to the governor, insisting that they were in fact not part of the attack on the city and thus should not be punished by any retributions meted out by the government. But in 1857, Leschi would be arrested for the supposed murder of a local militiaman during the Puget Sound War. Though he had indeed been involved in the fighting during the war, the consensus amongst both his fellow Nisqually and even the Americans themselves, soldiers and settlers alike, is that Leschi is indeed innocent of these charges. In fact, his first trial had resulted in a hung jury. Then, a retrial was ordered, and Governor Stevens, hungry to make an example of Leschi in hopes of dissuading any further attacks, had heavily pressured legal officials for a conviction. The second trial would indeed result in a guilty verdict, and Leschi was sentenced to be executed by hanging at Fort Steilacoom. This sentence was seen as such a judicial travesty that the local sheriff, Tom Granger, submitted to arrest rather than carry out the hanging. Officers at the fort also protested, arguing that the only killing Leschi had done had been in battle, which was not a crime necessitating capital punishment. They viewed him as a fellow warrior, and though an enemy combatant, still worthy of respect. Many protests from the Nisqually and other native tribes, as well as settlers throughout the area, poured into Governor Stevens' office, but fell on deaf ears. Thus, on February 19, 1858, Chief Leschi, a baptized Catholic since his youth, walked to the gallows at the fort, accompanied by the fort's Catholic priest, Father Pascal Ricard. Eyewitness accounts describe Leschi as dignified and courageous in his last moments, but all remark on the great travesty of justice he suffered before meeting his death at the end of the hangman's noose. This incident was seen as judicial murder, plain and simple, and forever damaged relations between the Americans and the native tribes. It also did irreparable damage to the reputation of Governor Stevens. In the coming years, the Puget Sound War would come to an end, and Seattle would continue to expand. And the Nisqually and their neighbors would see their territories continue to contract in the face of encroaching settlement. The Nisqually would find themselves confined to the Medicine Creek Reservation, where they would continue to see their lands shrink until many of them were displaced again by the United States in 1917 during World War I. Stevens himself would be called back into duty with the Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Appointed as Colonel of the 79th New York Volunteers, he would later be promoted to Brigadier General. On September 1, 1862, he would be killed in the Battle of Chantilly, after attempting to carry the regimental colors when his color-bearer was wounded in the initial charge against the Confederate forces. He would be laid to rest in Rhode Island in 1862, only 4 years after Chief Leschi's execution. Though the Battle of Seattle resulted in relatively few deaths and casualties, the ripple effect of the attack resounded through the Pacific Northwest for decades. In the decades that followed, Seattle would grow from a small settlement to a sizable port city, and eventually to its current iteration as a modern metropolitan hub for technology, medicine, education, and industry. Most of Seattle's current 800,000-plus residents, along with over 4 million residents in the greater Seattle area, have likely never heard of the 1856 life and death fight between native warriors and early Seattle residents. But this battle played a pivotal role in not only the history of their city, but in the history of the native tribes of their area and the United States as well. But the many stories of the Puget Sound War, as well as the proud native peoples of the Pacific Northwest and the intrepid settlers of the American West, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
In our final episode this evening, we travel to Mexico City in the year 1848 for one of the most pivotal, most brutal battles in the history of the Mexican-American War, a conflict that shaped two countries and would change the course of history. Here now, the story of the U.S. Marines at the Battle of Chapultepec Castle.
Mexico City, September 13, 1847. As Chapultepec Castle casts a formidable shadow in the early morning light, the fields below its towering stone walls erupt in an onslaught of attacking United States Army infantrymen, as well as a small contingent of United States Marines. Inside the stone walls and lining the parapets of the medieval-looking structure are 750 Mexican soldiers composed of local natives, itinerant farmers, and adolescent cadets from the nation's military school headquartered here at the castle. They are Mexico's last line of defense in the ongoing Mexican-American War, the final barrier to the American forces taking of Mexico City. As the men inside the castle attempt to aim and fire upon their attackers, many are rebuffed by the incessant thunderous striking of U.S. artillery fire into the castle walls. The American barrage has not stopped since it began the day prior, and every shot seems to further disrupt the nervous systems of the defenders atop the walls. As a thick miasma of gun smoke envelops them, the shrieks and groans of the wounded mix with the shouts of orders from the commanding officers, creating a horrifying cacophony of gore and chaos. In the fields beneath the castles, the American forces have been tasked with what many among them consider to be an impossible mission of weathering the Mexican defenders' fire and scaling the steep castle walls. However, under the staunch direction of their officers, they storm forward, knowing that every second spent in the open could be their last, as bullets and artillery rain down upon them. For their part, the Marines have already carved out a formidable reputation as an invaluable American military asset. It had been November 10, 1775, when, in the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress had authorized the creation of 2 battalions of Marines. The concept of Marines, soldiers trained to fight at sea and on land, was derived from the British tradition. Many of America's first Marines had served in His Majesty's Royal Marines, learning the unique challenges of fighting aboard wooden ships and conducting amphibious operations. These early iterations of Marines were essentially maritime raiders, whose task was to serve aboard American ships, board enemy vessels, and conduct small unit landing operations. In March 1776, the Continental Marines conducted their first amphibious landing, raiding British naval installations in the Bahamas. Samuel Nicholas, the Corps' first commandant, seized gunpowder and weapons desperately needed by Washington's army. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Marines served aboard American warships, fighting as sharpshooters from the rigging and leading boarding parties. During the long and ruthless war, they developed a reputation for accuracy with their muskets and fierce hand-to-hand combat skills. After independence, the Marines were briefly disbanded, but threats to American shipping from Barbary pirates led to its reestablishment in 1798 under President John Adams. This new Marine Corps would face its first major test in the Mediterranean. Their involvement in what would come to be known as the Barbary Wars solidified the Marine Corps culture. In the Corps' first major land operation, Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon led an expedition across 600 miles of desert to attack the Libyan city of Tripoli in 1805. During the War of 1812, Marines again proved their worth in ship-to-ship combat. Aboard the USS Constitution and other American frigates, they served as sharpshooters, picking off enemy officers and helmsmen at crucial moments. Between wars, the Marines developed a unique dual role. They provided security at America's naval yards and also served as a ceremonial unit in Washington. The Marine Band, known as the President's Own, became a symbol of national dignity at official functions. By 1846, on the eve of the Mexican-American War, the Marine Corps was a small but highly professional force. They numbered only about 1,000 men, but their combination of naval and land warfare skills made them uniquely valuable for the coming campaign. When war broke out with Mexico, Marines were among the first units deployed. Now, their unique skill set will be tested to its utmost in the fight for Chapultepec Castle. Along with their rifles and sidearms, the Marines carry climbing ropes and shoulder-long climbing ladders with which to scale the walls of the castle. The castle itself Its very shape and structure, harkening back to the days of the 11th century Crusades, is a national landmark of great pride for the Mexican people. The beleaguered Mexican forces fighting on behalf of General Santa Anna's army have endured weeks of critical defeats at the hands of the encroaching U.S. military forces, and have resorted to melting down the giant bells that had once adorned the castle parapets for use in making bullets and cannonballs. The veterans among them are mostly members of the Battalion de San Blas, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Felipe Xicotencal. In the preceding days, these men have spent the majority of their time in hard labor, attempting to fortify the walls of the castle with sandbags and add to its defenses by digging ditches around its perimeter. Now, after nearly 24 hours of artillery bombardment, much of their efforts have been withered away under the effects of cannon fire. With every diminution of their defenses, many among the Mexican forces feel their morale begin to waver, as the looming possibility of being overrun by the Americans seems to be a more and more likely scenario. Still, the youngest among them remain undaunted. To the great admiration of their elders and superiors, the roughly 50 cadets from the National Military Academy now fight with unbridled tenacity, unleashing volley after volley into the attacking American forces. Despite their age and rudimentary training, their resolve carries the air of a Spartan-esque determination to fight until the very end in defense of their homeland. On September 11th, 2 days prior to this battle, Colonel Nicholas Bravo had ordered that all of the military academy's cadets evacuate the castle, as he had assumed the oncoming American attack would indeed be a brutal affair. In preparation for the assault, the American forces have been split into 2 factions of 250 men each. The first group is commanded by U.S. Army Captain Silas Casey and General John Quitman. Just after 8 a.m., they reach the road that leads to the entrance of the castle. As rifle fire, cannonballs, and grape shot pepper the ground around them and decimate their ranks, the Marines finally reach the base of the castle walls. Here, as fire continues to fall down upon them from the defenders directly above, they rush into position with their scaling ladders. Moments later, as their Marine comrades provide covering fire at a near vertical trajectory, the first of the intrepid amphibious assaulters crests the top of the parapets and begin to lay down fire of their own as a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds atop the castle walls. In the midst of the vicious melee, Captain Silas Casey is grievously wounded, leaving Marine Corps Major Levi Twiggs in his place as commander. At the same time, a second party of American troops, under the command of Army Captain Samuel McKenzie and General Gideon Pello, advances up the eastern side of the hill atop which the castle lies. For roughly an hour, the battle unfolds as the American forces manage to breach the massive entrance gates and storm the entirety of the castle. Though they have fought ferociously against the divisions of Generals Worth, Quitman, and Pello at the base of the hill, the San Blas Battalion is nearly completely wiped out, with the survivors retreating further into the castle's interior. Atop the walls of the castle, the surviving Mexican troops from the San Blas Battalion, as well as the remaining young cadets, then fight on as they make a concerted strategic retreat to the castle's northeastern corner. The 5 remaining cadets, Agustin Melgar, Juan Escuchilla, Vicente Suarez, Francisco Marquez, and Fernando Montes de Oca, all between the ages of 13 and 20, fight on under the command of the young lieutenant from the National Military Academy, Lieutenant Juan de la Barrera. Finally, as all hope of victory is clearly lost, Cadet Juan Escuchilla, in a final act of defiance, wraps himself in the Mexican flag and leaps from the high stone walls to his death, rather than be captured by the American forces. By 9 a.m., the battle for Chapultepec Castle is over, as General Bravo officially surrenders to the U.S. Army's New York Regiment, and the U.S. Marines hoist the first American flag over the walls of the castle. Though the battle is over, the repercussions of the Battle of Chapultepec have only just begun. They will both be harsh and immediate. At the American field headquarters, a group of 30 Irish immigrants will be among the first to suffer the ramifications of Mexico's defeat. They are known as the San Patricios, or the St. Patrick's Battalion, recent immigrants who had defected from the U.S. Army after suffering the rampant anti-Catholic treatment of their Protestant officers. They had instead chosen to cross the Rio Grande and join forces with their Papist brothers in General Santa Anna's army. Here, they had fought valiantly in several engagements, gaining the enduring admiration of their Mexican comrades in arms. However, they had finally been overrun at the Battle of Churubusco on August 20th, just weeks earlier. Now, under the orders of William S. Harney, they are to be executed by hanging. As a particularly pointed caveat to these orders, Harney has insisted that the men be lined up and made to wait for their demise until the moment the American flag is raised over the walls of Chapultepec in victory. As the flag of the victorious American forces is raised, the lives of the unfortunate San Patricios are snuffed out en masse at the end of 30 rawhide ropes. This action, combined with the execution of 16 more men on September 10th at San Angel and 4 more on September 11th at the village of Mixcoac, is the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. While more than 9,000 American troops deserted during the war, only the San Patricios would face such harsh punishment at the hands of the U.S. Army officers. Back at the castle, General Scott arrives to the cheers of the American forces, and arrangements are quickly made for the Americans to now continue their attack towards Mexico City. By early afternoon, the Army's 15th Infantry has been left to stand guard over the castle, as General Quitman leads the remaining soldiers and Marines as they make their way towards the 2 critical remaining points of ingress into the capital city. The Belen Gate is defended by the Morelia Battalion, commanded by General Andreas Terres. They are composed of 3 cannons and 180 men. However, with their ammunition supplies already dwindling and now rapidly diminishing, Terres and his men quickly draw back to Mexico City, leaving the American soldiers and Marines with now unfettered access to General Santa Anna's last remaining stronghold. Here, with victory in sight, the American forces will face perhaps their greatest challenge yet in the Mexican-American War. Though they have made relatively quick and brutally decisive work out of taking Chapultepec Castle, the fight that will unfold next will be among the most costly in American military history. Though they have comported themselves with distinction on this day, giving birth to the Marine Corps hymn's famous line, "From the hulls of Montezuma," the Marines in particular will face horrendous losses in the battle to come. Major Levi Twiggs, hero of this seminal engagement in the Corps' history, will fall just days later on September 15th, alongside 29 other Marines, leaving their casualty rate for the Battle of Mexico City at over 90%, and forever cementing the Marines' reputation as a small but tenacious and uniquely valuable fighting force in the American military arsenal. For General Santa Anna, this is truly the beginning of the end, as the fall of Mexico City, as he well knows, will result in Mexico's ultimate defeat in the war. But the stories of heroism, sacrifice, and suffering on both sides of the Battle of Mexico City, as well as the highly consequential and highly controversial ending to the war, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click that like button to share this episode with a fellow history lover and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. It's right down there. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram and on TikTok and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. All that is down there in the link below. I know you will love it. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.